And we are back on this 0 hour. You know, back in the early days of American student radicalism, at least as I remember them, there used to be a bumper sticker that said, "Kill your radio." I guess because radio was too commercial, but maybe we shouldn't kill the radio. Maybe we should teach it to do neat tricks. Joining us now is another person who's trying to do that. David Pakman is host of the David Pakman Show. He is a television and radio host, political commentator, internet personality, and political activist. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'll start with a very general question, since, you know, we got an open-ended conversation going here. You've got the David Pakman Show that's available around the country and through the miracles of the internet, anytime, anywhere. Are we crazy to be trying to save progressive talk radio?
No, absolutely not. I mean, it may not be that it's saved or ultimately thrives in the kind of traditional form where if you're on a 50,000 watt radio station versus 25,000 watt, that's sort of the difference maker. The radio piece is part of what we're doing, but we're also using the internet. We're using the increased ubiquity of internet coming to cars and podcasting and YouTube and things like this. So, you know, I think there's no question that there's a demand for progressive ideas. What the best sort of delivery method for those ideas is, I think, what now is being sussed out and iterated.
Yeah, I go ahead. I don't know if you had anything else to add to that before I jump in.
No.
But I was going to say that, you know, I think that's exactly right. And I love that answer. That was very well said. And I think that part of what draws me, for example, to We Act Radio, people like Alex Lawson and all that, is the understanding that in this day and age, radio is not, as you say, a 50,000 watt signal. I mean, I love the days when you could sell medicine show cures, you know, from a Mexican border radio station that reached 15 states. But that's not radio anymore. What radio is part of a broader, it includes emails, it includes databases, it includes online publications, it includes, as you say, YouTube, visual media, as well as auditory media. And it exists not just as one chunk of time, let's say drive time or whatever, but in small discrete chunks out of that can be reproduced and played and embedded in different places. And I guess that's what we're both trying to do, right?
Yeah, no question about it. And if you look at the sort of market opportunity that exists, there's the market opportunity of ideas, which is, as I talked about this week on my program, people attack Bernie Sanders as socialist, but when you poll them fairly on the issues, the predominant views in this country are really not very far from those of Bernie Sanders. So the marketplace of ideas is favorable, but also the business market opportunity is there in the sense that we have the millennial age group, we have the broader 18 to 44 age group, quite educated, making a good salary, that is willing to support and pay attention to and fund the new wave of progressive media. The podcast market is, by some estimates, 50 million listeners or even bigger just in the United States. Digital video ad spending is there. So there's still this sort of skepticism that exists in some areas with regard to new media, but the progressive side of new media is really well positioned, I think, if the right people are at the helm, right? There's no guarantees, but if the right people get involved, I think there's a huge opportunity there.
You know, I like your comparison of the marketplace of ideas with the kind of the marketplace of different forms of media and so on, because I think, you know, Bernie Sanders is a great example. You know, socialism is kind of like a smorgasbord. You know, I think smorgasbord because it's Scandinavian, but, you know, where people might say, well, you know, I don't like smorgasbord. What do you got in your smorgasbord? Well, I got chocolate cake. Well, I love chocolate cake. Well, I got steak. Well, I love steak. You know, so the idea of breaking away from those conventional brandings and packagings, and it I think is an important part of that. And to that point, David Pakman, host of the David Pakman Show, one of the things that in reading your bio, I see that you and I have in common is that we both consider ourselves independent. I am, as of the last few years, a registered independent. Obviously, I'm not one of those mythical independents who's somehow midway between the Democratic and Republican Party. I've probably never voted for a Republican, but and unlikely to ever. But I am independent for a couple reasons. One, mainly because, in the words of those great political scientists, it's destiny's child. I figure free your mind and the rest will follow. But secondly, because I think more importantly, and I want your thoughts on this, I think when you label yourself with a party label or perhaps even with the progressive label, I don't know, then you start to defend the tribe that shares that label as opposed to just pushing for the best outcomes and policies. What are your thoughts on that?
There's definitely an element to that. You know, I vote in Massachusetts where you don't, being registered independent is not so much a positive delineation, but it's unregistered with regard to any of the particular parties. But essentially it's the same idea. And for me, I can't think of any Republicans I voted for like you. I tend to vote for Democrats. But what really was the issue for me is that on so many issues, there is no tangible difference between Democrats and Republicans. So even if I agree more with Democrats, and particularly on social issues, and I'm mostly going to vote for Democrats, I had no particular impetus or reason to affiliate myself with a party that I really disagree with on so much, insofar as they don't distinguish themselves from the plutocratic, corporatist Republican status quo. So, yeah, I think that you and I have pretty similar thinking along those lines.
Yeah, good to hear. It's nice to meet a fellow traveler. And by the way, I vote in California, where being an independent doesn't prevent me from having my input in the primaries, which I do think is important. And should I move to a state where I need to be a Democrat to vote in the primaries, I suspect I would go back to it. But I think, I'm thinking about independent thinking. We've got a campaign, a presidential election coming up. I don't want to be so attached to the success of a party that I don't push the right policies. Now, another thing that I see that you and I have in common is that I spent years in the corporate world and Wall Street and everywhere else. I see that you have an MBA and have a background in economics. I have a background in economics. And I think the other thing that is important is that, I used to do corporate work with a Catholic order, and the nun who ran it used to say, "No margin, no mission." Meaning, if our healthcare projects aren't sustainable and we don't have income to keep it going, we can't do the good works. And I kind of feel that way about progressive radio, and the progressive whatever it is we do, commentary, that it's got to at least be sustainable. So to that, I guess I see, the radio stations that, for example, you're broadcast on or I'm broadcast on, they're an essential part of a mosaic. It's got to benefit them enough that they still want us. It's got to benefit us enough that we can pay our bills and so on. And there's got to be a way to fit all these different technologies together for a sustainable model, for an independent alternate voice in this country. Do you agree with that? Do you have any thoughts about how we might go about doing that?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And as we were starting to come up, now we're in New York City, but where we started in Western Massachusetts, there was a time early on in my show when we started going in the direction of turning this into something that was self-sustaining, where we didn't need everybody to volunteer. People could be paid. This would be a business that worked. And there were a lot of people who considered themselves progressives and activists and on the side of progressive media who took issue with the fact that I was thinking about this not only from my personal activism point of view, but also in terms of turning it into a viable business. They felt that it was a sort of selling out, or that I was in some way distracting or deviating from the mission. And I would very calmly explain every time, we are not going to get the message out unless this can support itself. If I'm just struggling to get my $25 radio show membership paid so that I can come in and get my time at the radio station, that's going to take away from reporting on the stories and doing the interviews and getting the messages out. So I challenged all those people forget about the fact that my show is now being funded in a more proper and sustainable way. Tell me how the ideas I'm presenting in any way represent a sellout. And of course they couldn't, because the show is more progressive than ever. As we grow, I'm only fueled in my progressivism, and that I realize that having these ideas is not going to prevent me from having a viable show that can sustain itself. So no question, I think we should not fall into the trap of thinking that if there is a viable business here, that we're somehow not really progressive.
No margin, no mission. And I find that the closer we get to that sustainability, we're not talking about Lear jets. We're talking about sustainability of a radio program that can meet its expenses and provide good videos, which, we're still working on. I think, be candid about that. But we want to get better at what we do. We want to give a quality message that people respond to. But, I had exactly the same I've had exactly the same response that you've had, David Pakman, host of the David Pakman Show, which is the more I see how people respond to a really independent, progressive message, and it is. I mean, I joke about Destiny's Child, but in a way, it is a free your mind kind of message. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery, as Bob Marley would say. That the people respond to that. People appreciate that, and I think that helps. And I guess I would say, without trying to throw shade on other people in our line of work, I would say this is what distinguishes what we do. Or I don't want to throw you in this fight if you don't want to, but from what, for example, an MSNBC does, where it's kind of widely understood that they're associated with more closely with a political party and certain individual politicians than I think we care to be. But you can here's where you can distance yourself from that comment if you want to.
Well, I've been pretty clear for many years that while I agree with a lot of the editorial ideas presented on MSNBC by hosts, that at its core we're still dealing with a corporate media outlet that has made a different editorial decision than Fox News has made. And as we've seen over the years, certainly their policy with regard to political contributions by talent may be different than that over at Fox News. But I've questioned whether that format, that type of venue, is the best place to get progressive ideas across. It's not necessarily that it's worthless along that mission, but I think there's real questions to ask about whether progressive ideas are going to be communicated most effectively by a corporate media outlet. How could anyone not question that?
Right. I think that's a great point. And I also think that, look, if I understand that the desire to maintain positive relationships with those in, at least in power in one party, in order to, that gives you access, that gives you information, that gives you guests and so on. And it's easy to diss that. It's just not my thing. And I guess I get disappointed when I see outlets spend so much time running down the enemy without, those ridiculous Republicans, without spending more time offering constructive progressive ideas. But that said, David Pakman, I guess I'll go out with this. It is sometimes irresistible to talk about those ridiculous Republicans. And I noticed that you mentioned this guy who is sexting and probably doing more than that, his 18-year-old staffer, and is yet another Republican telling us how we should live our private sexual lives while violating one of the great taboos of modern culture, which is, I don't know. To me, I try to stay high-minded, but this stuff, how do you look away from it?
Yeah, you really can't, because there's this just obvious double standard where, of course, we're talking about a pro-family, man of God, family values, and all of that type of stuff inform why he doesn't think two men who love each other should be able to get married. That's a moral, that's a position being made from his moral high ground, but at the same time, sexting a college intern. And what's fascinating is that the intern program got shut down altogether very abruptly a few weeks ago, and it was unclear what might have been going on. And then we hear about this, and just the story reeks of this double standard and the projection that have sort of become expected on a daily basis from the party that claims to have the moral majority.
Exactly. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But, you're always hearing can't allow gay marriage because then the next thing you know, there'll be polygamy, and marriage should be between one woman and one man who also has sex with people just out of high school. That seems to be the Republican model. So, but we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, David Pakman, I encourage all of you to check out the David Pakman Show. And David, thanks for coming on the Zero Hour.
Thank you for having me.
We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.